So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, people from Prague, Bratislava, and good afternoon to Canada. Today, we are broadcasting from three republics, although the organizer of this event is Center for Architecture and City Planning Camp, we call it Camp, and it's located in Prague. My name is Milota Sidorová. I live in Bratislava, but my history is shared with people from Camp and in Prague, where I used to work through several projects. And I think it was a funny coincidence, or maybe a good story for me to be invited here, since when I lived in Prague, I started to go around topics of gender equality and architecture and planning, and I was nagging around so much that my friends who are now working at Camp and Institute of Planning, namely Adam Švejda and Stepan Bartl, when they were doing dramaturgy for this series of events, told me there is a great woman that we are going to invite. Her name is Leslie Kern, and she wrote this book, Feminist City. And I said, right, I'm going to write a review on it. I said, okay, maybe you can moderate the event. So for me, this is a pleasure because I always wanted to meet Leslie, and today is a little Christmas for me as I'm going to have a discussion with her. So just to say something about the series of events, we are in a series called Urban Talks. Everybody's talking nowadays and on podcasts and online. And this is a series of events that Camp decided to do for people from Prague to bring more international perspective on Czechoslovakian or Central European city planning. And they had more than 20 events right now, and they always invite somebody from international field. And it's not only international, but it's also interdisciplinary. So except of architects, you can find many sociologists. And today I think we are continuing with the stream of social or human perspective on cities with my guest, Leslie Kern. And before I jump into her presentation, let me invite first Leslie, welcome, and I hope we have stable connection. Can you hear us? Yes. You need to turn on the mic.
Yes, hello. I was just trying to find the controls. They disappeared for a minute. Yes, hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it's an honor. First, I'm going to introduce you a little bit, and then we'll go to your presentation. For friends and colleagues who are watching the stream, it's not only two of us talking today. You can help us by joining slido.com, and there is hashtag #CampuiOnline, through which you can pose a question. I'm going to check it on my desktop today if there is a question. So something about Leslie Kern, I think I can be totally truthful if I say she's a great narrator or storyteller, but this is the advantage of great urban geographers or human geographers. And she is Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University in Canada. This is like northeast part of Canada, far north, and this is a small place far from these big cities where you are located for some time. Leslie wrote a book, Feminist City, but this is not her first book. Before, she was doing work, research, and book on other books, namely to say Sex and the Revitalized City, Gender, Condominium Development, and Urban Citizenship. And this is your last book, which was published on Verso. And now I heard it's getting very much noticed by international community with not only English version, but also Spanish, German, and Turkish. So, Leslie, once again, pleasure to have you here. And maybe let's start with what you have to say, and then we jump into discussion.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. And yes, I'm joining you today from the small town of Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, on Canada's East Coast. I thought I would start off by just sharing a little bit about the book, since you may not have had a chance to check it out yet, but maybe if a Czech publisher is interested, we would be very happy to see it come out there. So why the notion of the feminist city? Let me just start there. in a basic way, it's important to just recognize that issues of gender equity are still very much an afterthought in many cities, maybe most cities, especially when it comes to the importance of care labor. And I'm going to talk a bit more about care labor in my relatively brief remarks here this evening, but it's something that has certainly been emphasized for me over the last almost year now in the context of the pandemic, and has been quite a popular topic of conversation over the last year. But let me say a little bit more about the book. So why did I write this particular book? Well, in my day job as a professor at a university and as an academic and a researcher, I get to talk about this kind of stuff all the time with my peers, colleagues, students, but we tend to be having a very academic conversation, and we tend to be taking for granted that we all know what we're talking about, that we all are kind of on the same page, or that there is a shared understanding of some of these core ideas about how society and the spaces around us, like our built environments, like cities, how they shape one another in a kind of mutual feedback. So society shapes the spaces that we build and even our natural environments. And those spaces in turn affect us in different ways. And that's very much an idea that has come to seem quite natural and common sense to me because of what I do. But I realize that it's not something that many people going about their day-to-day lives would really be consciously aware of. And so part of why I wanted to write the book was to just share this perspective more broadly and to give people a way to look around their cities or really any space and to ask certain kinds of questions like, why is it designed this way? Who benefits from this space? Who feels included? Who feels excluded? And maybe even asking, how is power being played out through this built environment? What kinds of social power relations are kind of built in almost brick by brick or pavement by pavement into the city? So I wanted to bring that perspective and that conversation to a wider audience. So in that sense, my second point, who is the book for? Well, I really envisioned it as something that anyone who's interested in cities, whether they live there or are just fascinated by or love to travel to a city, would be able to pick up this book and relate to some of the experiences that I describe in it, and to have this new sort of sight of being able to look around and say, oh, I never noticed this before, or now I really see how this works, and to have that a kind of a deeper perspective, another layer of understanding. But it's also been interesting to me that people like planners, architects, and students in those disciplines have been quite interested in this book over the last year. I didn't really know whether it would speak to people in those professions, but I'm encouraged that there does seem to be this interest in learning more about how we can make cities more equitable, more sustainable, and more just. So what will you find in this book? As I said, it's written for quite a general audience, so it's not packed full of academic theory, although there is theory in there. But as Milota mentioned, there is some storytelling. So I grew up in and around Toronto, which is Canada's biggest city, about 4.5 million people there. And I also lived in London, England for a time. And those urban experiences really were quite formative for me in many different ways. Everything from experiences of feeling fear and unsafe in urban environments to feeling really free and excited and independent in city spaces. So the book includes some of those stories, personal experiences as starting points, as entry points, so that other people could maybe say, oh, yeah, I've experienced that feeling, or I've had a hard time getting on the bus with my children, or maybe even to say, oh, I haven't experienced that because I'm not a parent, or I don't have a disability, or I'm not a woman. And to say, oh, maybe I can see that in a different way. So in the book, you'll find this kind of mix of stories from my own life and experiences, a little bit from popular culture, the news media, and current events, as well as the perspective of lots of feminist writers, including geographers, but also sociologists and historians and cultural theorists that help us to kind of make sense of how all of these gender and other issues play out in the urban environment. So what should you do with this book? Well, that's partly what I'll try to take us through in the last few minutes of my presentation here, is that the book is not a blueprint. The book does not set out to say, this is how we should build cities. This is the design that will work for everybody. But the book does aim to share, I guess, a set of values or principles that one might take on and consider when one perhaps is in a role to have some influence over something in the city. If you are an architect or a planner, or maybe you're just a citizen who wants to have a say in whether there will be a new park at the end of the street or where your bus route will go. So it's meant to kind of empower people to ask a different set of questions about who the city works for, who it doesn't work for, and what we might do about it. So I thought I would take you through a few of those principles, give a few examples just to kind of warm up the conversation for Milota and I. And as she mentioned, please feel free to share your own questions that we could take up as well. So here are just a few principles that we might keep in mind in thinking about the idea of the feminist city. So one of those would be equality of access to public space, certainly an issue that many of us have perhaps noticed more in the time of the pandemic, as we've been encouraged to be making use of outdoor spaces for social functions. But we have confronted questions of who gets to be in those spaces, what do they feel like, who is welcome there and who is not. Reimagining the home and the family. So the residential part of cities is a key component about what a city is. People live there, but how do we live in cities? What kinds of family forms are supported by the physical features of the kinds of homes that we have? Do we have apartment buildings, single family homes, or do we have a wide variety of household types that we might have? Mobility is really key. So how do people move through the city? Cars are so heavily emphasized in most urban planning, but we have to think about public transportation, about walking, and women in particular make a lot of walking journeys, and biking and other modes of mobility as well. So how do we make mobility really equitable in ways that's not just about getting someone from home to work in a linear one-way journey, but that recognizes the wide variety of mobility needs that people have. Safety is also key. People often think about women and cities, and we go to this assumption of, there's a lot of fear that women have in cities, the fear of the dark alley, the stranger, the attack in public space. And certainly safety has taken up a lot of space in thinking about cities and gender. So I recognize that it's an important topic, but it's also one that we have to think quite carefully about in terms of how do we want safety to be provided? Are we imagining more police, more surveillance, more private security forces? Or could we think about safety, as I say here, from the ground up, from the community level? So safety, but thinking critically about where safety comes from. And a fifth point, how do we build care into urban infrastructure as a forethought? So not as something that we worry about later after we've taken care of this thing that we call the economy, as if it's separate from care labor and all of the work that happens both in the home and in the public sphere in terms of care. How do we really make that a central feature of our cities, really build it into our mobility systems, to our public spaces, to the services that we provide, and keep it kind of central and not relegate it to something that we only worry about when there is a crisis, like a pandemic and a public health crisis. So what does it mean then to kind of take these principles to envision a more feminist city? And I say more feminist because I don't know that there is a perfect utopia that we will reach at some point, but that there's kind of a journey that we might go on towards this vision. So one of the key things that I think anyone involved in city building, again, planners, architects, and everyday people can take in mind is the idea of margin to center. What I mean by this is that too often there's this assumption that there is a typical user of a space or a building, and that typical user is able-bodied, it's a man, they are probably white or of the dominant racial group in that society. They are not using a mobility device like a wheelchair or a walker. They're not bringing children or babies with them. And the assumption is that this user is kind of this economic subject who's going to work and is productive or is spending money in the city. But what I want to suggest is that that subject is probably maybe the minority, actually, of users of urban space. When we take all of the other groups who are assumed to be sort of special interest or niche groups, whether that's women, disabled people, parents, senior citizens, people of color, queer and trans people, this is the majority, right? This is not the niche. This is the center. So how could we take the perspectives of these people who are usually kind of left out of planning or seen as a niche or special interest group in planning and put their needs at the center? And the amazing thing about that is that the typical subject, the man, the able-bodied man, he'll be fine. None of that will take away from his needs or his ability to move through the city. It will improve access for everybody. So let's bring the margin to the center and recognize that the minority is maybe actually the majority in the city. Another point I'll make is that the symbolic matters. And I think over the last summer, with the resurgence of global Black Lives Matter movements and the effort to kind of remove some of the symbols of white supremacy, of colonization, of male dominance from spaces, that it's important to note that well, the symbolic is not everything. It doesn't translate automatically into equality. It does suggest something about inclusion. So if we see images of people who look like us or monuments of a greater diversity of people or the flags of Indigenous groups, for example, in the image in the bottom corner, that's my university with the flag of the local Indigenous group whose territories we live on. If statues of colonizers or slave owners are removed, if places are renamed, it tells us something about who belongs. And I think it does communicate a powerful message about belonging. From a gender perspective, if you look up statues of women, you'll find that around the world, there are very few statues of real women, of actual women who existed. There's lots of statues of sort of the naked female body, just the female form, but very few statues of real women. And interestingly, the one that's pictured here, this silver image, this is a new monument to Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. But interestingly, we have still this naked image of a woman. So kind of it's raised some controversy about, how we see women in public space, what the sort of the form of that is. But something to keep in mind as you move through the city, how many places are named for women. And it does, again, tell us something about power. The next thing I'll mention comes back to this issue around care in the city. For so long, all of the caring functions of looking after children, feeding a family, caring for the sick, looking after the home, it's assumed to be private labor that just happens inside the home, and of course is still disproportionately done by women in the home. But what if we thought about ways to make that labor more collective, to bring it into the public sphere, to value it, to show it as something that should not be hidden away and made invisible, but as something that can really be a collective effort? So could we imagine using our urban public spaces to feed people, right? To have places to cook and to share food and to provide meals? Could we imagine our urban public spaces as sites of learning for children, as educational sites? And again, the pandemic is a moment where we're being asked to really perhaps push this a little bit more, because we've found that as our governments have said, go outside, don't gather inside, find ways to use outdoor space. Many of us have noticed that our urban spaces aren't really set up to do this, that they're not very hospitable for the average person. So it's a great moment where we could perhaps reimagine some of what the urban realm is about. And as part of that, my last point here will be, how do we start from the body? So much of urban planning and design seems to treat the body as an afterthought. And we have to remind people that we all have bodies. We all need to use the toilet. We all need rest. We need water and food. We need shelter and shade. And if those things are not available to people, then it's a form of exclusion. It means you can't really participate in the public life of the city if you can't use a bathroom that is safe for you or matches your gender identity, or if it's not physically accessible for you due to a disability. So can we start from the body? Can we remember that things like bathrooms and elevators and places to sit are not just nice features to add on at the end of a design, but that maybe they could be at kind of the heart of the design. And this would go a long way towards a more inclusive, equitable urban form. So bodies, people have bodies. So that's the end of my presentation and just some of the general principles that I wanted to share with you. So I hope that gives Milota some interesting points to jump off from for our conversation.
Well, definitely. Thank you, Leslie. And I think we'll be going through certain topics. Maybe at the beginning, I would like to tell you, I know that you gave us a lot of topics. I mean, we could fill entire semester with talking about mobility or symbolism, particularly interesting, or the role of public toilets in the public space. But maybe I'll bring you a little bit to Czechoslovak or Central Eastern European perspective, where I know some of my audience will laugh right now, but feminism is really F word, like we had a troubled history through 20th century. I just want to remind ourselves that after the Habsburg monarchy ended and the first Czechoslovak Republic was established, we had quite progressive democratic principles. Our president, Garrigue Masaryk, had a wife who was feminist. And during this time, women were pushed into public sphere and the emancipation started. Then, of course, during Second World War, it all was reversed by Nazis who saw women only at home or being a producer of children, nothing to talk about. Then, of course, when communism and socialism came, political representation found out that we need women to work. But of course, they work and they had double shift at home because they still had to do the caregiving jobs. So it wasn't totally balanced, but we were out there. Our women had bank accounts, they could divorce. Many of those things that Western Europe didn't have at 60s, 70s was already in here in Czech Republic and Slovakia. And then after 89, when we got democracy, I think this is particularly my time when I was growing up. I used to hear these politicians, even presidents, talking about feminists as really ugly women with short hair, with full of complex, lesbians, and it was this image of frustrated woman. And as I was growing around myself, particularly with women who were studying abroad, I said, we are not this, but we feel emancipated enough. So I have a feeling, especially right now in Prague, Bratislava, there are many women of age 30s. We didn't have the education in gender studies. We didn't have the education about feminism, but we feel that we have the same right to enter profession, enter public life, talking about politics, have our life as well, good enough because we are equal citizens. But sometimes, or like most often, even my colleagues don't understand this, even if they feel are part of this progressive young generation. So, first question: how would you explain Feminist City in a nutshell to a Central European, I mean, say, male architect? Like, why does it matter?
Well, I'll try to put it in a nutshell, but as you say, that could really be a very long conversation. I think a good starting point would just be first to recognize that different people have different experiences of the city in this case. So one place that, and this is not just, I think, a conversation for Central Europe. This is the same conversation that I might have with students in my class in Canada who, again, people think we're all equal. There's no problems anymore. Is there still sexism? And I will ask the class, how many of you feel afraid when you walk home at night? How many of you say to your friend, text me when you get home so I know you're safe? How many of you walk with your keys balled up in your fist or with your phone in your hand, knowing that you might need to call for help at some time or just to make you feel safer? And for the most part, every woman in the class will say, yes, I've felt that or I've done that. And the men will be like, oh, hardly ever have I felt that unless there was a direct threat. So that's just one example that on a very experiential everyday level, we have a different sense of our place in the city. And that, it's taken for granted. Of course, women should be more fearful. We're so vulnerable, but why? Why should we feel that way? And what effect does that have on us? So then the next question would be, well, if you lived in an area that, felt unsafe, would you be able to take a job working at night somewhere? But because, so it can have consequences in terms of people's material survival. So it's starting from experience is a key one. And then we could ask questions about mobility again. So are your transit systems set up to accommodate a stroller or children on the bus? And if not, that's probably something that affects women day to day more than it affects men. Questions about things, in North America, we have this term, the pink tax, which is meant to refer to things that just cost women more. And that's not just your haircut, for example, but it could also be your cost of transportation. And again, might be related to safety. Do you feel safe walking or do you need to pay for a taxi home? So is there kind of a pink tax to being a woman? And beyond that, we can ask questions about, who are the architects? Who are the planners? Who are the politicians? Is this still mostly male dominated? And in most places it still is. So what perspectives are being left out from the top when we think about urban space? So in a nutshell, then, the Feminist City is kind of asking these questions about different experiences and about whose experiences are really being represented within these key professions, and then saying, okay, well, what are some ways that we could improve this equity of access to public space for everybody?
Yeah, thank you for this. It's always start with basically challenging the city, and you say that the city is like frozen, not only architecture but also political system, societal system. And then if we ask who produced this system or which group, I don't have anything against individual men, but what you're pointing and the book is pointing at was always a group, quite homogeneous group of men of certain, let's say, wealth, education, ethnic group, which was always at the power. And it seems that the book describes all these things when city is not working, because why? And I was trying to find out the pattern in the book, because cities were built for basically professional life. Like professional life of whom? Of the designers, of the politicians, who were free of duties regarding their family. So it seems like one way what book is describing is this city that is functioning for economically active, basically men. And on somewhere on the flip side, there are all these majorities, like elderly, caregiving, ethnic. And you are raising this question to say, hey, what about us? And I like the examples that you're giving. But then again, maybe to have certain familiarity with the audience, like what are the comments or like critiques that you have basically from other I don't know, academics, because the book is not academical. It's almost somewhere between essayistic storytelling perspective, and it raises very challenging questions. I mean, if I would be a man of certain architectural status, I would be very offended, basically.
Well, the criticism has ranged from, I guess, the very some very reactionary and I would just say misogynist criticism that just is not at all interested in hearing about these questions of power and says, oh, it's ridiculous to think that the city has anything to do with gender, and then devolves into sexist insults to me. So I don't take those comments too seriously, but I do think that does sort of reflect, as you said, this view that the city is kind of frozen. It's just this container. It's just this space that just kind of exists and doesn't have any active role in shaping our choices, our lives, our social systems, and so on. So people, again, haven't really been able to see that. And I guess a more moderate, I don't even know if it's a critique, but it's a sort of a reaction from some men. And I wouldn't say it's even necessarily a negative reaction, but they sort of say, oh, this book isn't really written to me. It's not really for me. And I sort of say, well, it sort of is, but you're just not at the center of it. So can you imagine something that you're very welcome to, but you're not at the center of it? And I think that has, is maybe something that is kind of uncomfortable for some people in power to sort of have to say, oh, maybe some of my privileges, which, it's not your fault, maybe that you haven't seen these things, but my privileges have made me kind of ignorant of other people's experiences in the city. And that can be an uncomfortable moment when we have to confront that something that we were sort of ignorant of and didn't know more about. But I think overall the reaction has been one of great interest. People, I think a lot of architects and planners, they want to make cities better. They want to make people's lives better, but it's not easy to know how to do that. And this book maybe can inspire some different ways of thinking.
Okay, let's go into the book. I'm a planner, so at the end of the day, there has to be some functional solution for things. But if I speak to the audience, the book is written in form of, it uses strongly your personality and your life stories. So you start with particularly funny situations and like your belly growing and suddenly the whole world noticing you and starting you giving comments about how you should live your life. And then of course it's this moment like, why would people care about this? It feels insulting. So it can be many times the book is very personal, using you as the storyteller, but then it goes into contextual or systemic levels. So it says something about bigger groups, or it talks about some movements or issues of mobility, or even movies. So it flips between personal perspective and the contextual perspective. And now I think what is my observation is very often architects and planners in this region, we didn't have sociology or are not really good in reading stories. We see the city as sum of projects and technical solutions. And what I realized while reading this book is that we need stories to give us a context to fall in love with the subjects that we are dealing with. It's not just a square, it's a place where so many life stories happen, and not only my, but so many of others. So I realized that I want to work more with geographers, because the geographers have or should have this notion of talking about society. And then I found out that there are not so many geographers around me who have your perspective. So I want to ask how you were taught geography, and if this is with this gender or Feminist City, if you are pushing limits of your profession, because this is definitely pushing architecture and planning, but are you this black sheep of urban geography back in Canada?
Well, I can tell you kind of maybe how I came to my perspective, which is that I didn't start out as a geographer, as an academic, not at all. I was in women's and gender studies. So I started to come to questions about the city out of my interest in gender equality, in feminist movements, in questions of power in society. And the city kind of came second to that. So I became a geographer out of interest in questions that I talked about in my first book, as you mentioned, around condominiums, which were kind of booming in Toronto and North America, and saying, why are these so popular with women? What does this mean for women's urban lives? And in a kind of feminist tradition, storytelling has often been really key, because for so long, women's perspectives have been left out of every discipline. For a very long time, they were not really looked at. And so part of just a broad feminist project has been to listen to women, to learn about women's lives. And often that means starting from things that seem very mundane and everyday, and that often other scholars and academics don't care about. Like, what is it like to look after children in the home? Or what does it feel like to walk down this street? Or these very like everyday questions of just the minutia of day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. So for me, bringing that to geography felt quite natural, because that was what I'd been kind of trained to do, right? To think about women's stories as ways to open up bigger conversations about power in the city. So I don't know that I'm a black sheep, but I would certainly, because there are a lot of feminist urban geographers and feminist geographers in general, which is great. But it's definitely true that there is still can be a divide between people who are more qualitative researchers versus more quantitative researchers. And even within the planning profession, there's often consultation is supposed to happen with communities, as I'm sure you know, but that can be kind of a messy process. It can be time consuming. It's not something that's always done very well. And so there may be a reluctance to really like engage in that dialogue with communities about what they need in their environments.
Okay. Let's move forward. I'm glad you're mentioning participatory planning, because this is what I do in Bratislava. And I think this is one of the ways how to maybe use this book as a takeaway for planners. Like, if you know your audience, meaning people, and you know that the society is not so homogeneous, as you say, then you know your target groups. And with careful participatory planning, you can address people, and particularly women of different age and ethnicity, and bring their perspective into planning process. But it's not enough. They should also have political representation and knowledge in profession. That's why this is important that you're addressing also professionals. But maybe let's go into structure of book. I like how you start, and you don't start with how like some takeaways for architects or like gender ideology. You start with you being pregnant, was there like this like aha moment, like eye-opening moment, like the world is not functioning for me in the city the same way as for the others? And can you see that around, in a woman around you, or maybe in society?
Yes. So absolutely. When I lived in London, I was pregnant, and I was, in my early 20s, and I had been living in big cities for several years at that point, and I loved living in the city. It was so exciting and fun for me. I felt so free and independent. And then when I was pregnant and then had my daughter, and so had a young baby with me, all of a sudden the city didn't work for me very well anymore. It was not very easy to travel. Everything from feeling sick on public transportation, from morning sickness and not being able to sit down, to trying to navigate with a stroller and a baby, find somewhere to take care of a baby, to nurse, to change them. All of that was suddenly seemed so challenging. And it was kind of an aha moment where I started to realize that the city was maybe really not for me. Like it was not designed for me. And in fact, maybe had this assumption that women like me are better off kind of at home or just going to the park, not really going into downtown areas, not riding public transit, not being visible in public space in the same way. So that perhaps started me on my journey to becoming a geographer. And what's been interesting in the course of having people read this book and tell me about it is that sense that people sort of will say, oh, it's not just me. I thought it was just me who felt this way. Or I thought that it was my fault somehow for not feeling right or not fitting in the right way. And I think the book has helped, as I think all good feminist research does, to help women and other marginalized people to not feel alone, to realize that it's not an individual problem, it's a bigger social issue that is creating these tensions, this discomfort, or even a real sense of inequality in their lives.
Yeah, I'm choosing this because basically the pregnancy or when you start to provide care, your life totally diverges from the male, for example. And we have this feminist or women perspective because this is a very simple distinction. But when you go through the book, and I like that you go like this, you don't only say about like this criteria of being men or women or some other gender, but you also speak about different categories, okay, age play game or ethnicity or economic income. And suddenly if you start to overlay these categories, there is this like total puzzle of society. And suddenly from feminism or like women issue, we reach out for this new term called intersectionality. So maybe you can explain that to the audience. And by now we have 6 questions. So I think we are provoking them quite a lot.
Great. So intersectionality is a way of thinking about how different systems of power intersect. So sexism intersecting with or coming together with other forms of power, such as racism, classism, homophobia, ableism, to create a kind of matrix, if you will, or a web of forces that shape someone's life. And as cultural theorist Stuart Hall famously said, he said, no one is just one thing. So nobody is just a woman or nobody is just a man, right? We all have multiple identities, whether that has to do with the color of our skin, our sexual orientation, our physical ability. And those different aspects of our identity place us kind of differently within that matrix of power. So for me, in thinking about Feminist City, it's not just about saying, we usually just think about men, so let's just think about women, because women are not just one thing. They are not just one group. There are women with very different sorts of needs and sets of, access to power, economic independence, and so on in the city. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's very important to at least say, how is this experience maybe going to be different for someone who is a recent immigrant or a single mother or a disabled woman or a lesbian, and not just someone who looks exactly like me. So that's partly what I try to do in the book, as you say, to add these layers so that, again, not that there's one answer to that, but just to have people say, okay, we have to at least think about those questions. We have to think about, as you said, who's our audience? Who is our community? And it's not just one thing or one group.
But on a political perspective, I think it's important to make this connection, feminist and this, let's say, looking to the world, like to everyone, because very often with, let's say, feminist movements or this emancipation movement came another emancipation movements for ethnic groups. So it were women, these were women through which came others into the focal group. So this is maybe why we're still speaking about feminism as this original catalyst. And through this, we are looking through different lenses. Anyways, let's go to the questions. So we have 8 right now. So I'm just picking right now the most popular. I think it's difficult. Can you recognize any low-hanging fruits in design practice of Feminist City, which is from Martin? And Sam also is asking question, what does feminist urban planning mean to you in actual flesh out urban practice? So it's like practical questions. In other words, how does Feminist City come into being?
Yes. Well, the low-hanging fruit question is a good one. And I think there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, things that cities could start to be doing tomorrow that don't cost a huge amount of money and don't involve getting out the bulldozer and destroying city blocks and building something new. So that could include things like safe and accessible public toilets so that people can use the bathroom, and for those spaces to have care spaces for children, disabled people, elderly as well. We could move towards making public transportation free for children, for example. So in some places it is, but in many places you have to pay to bring a small child onto the bus. And that's a barrier for people to use public transportation systems. Other things could include, as I mentioned in my talk, seating, places to sit, benches. Often cities have taken benches away to prevent homeless people from using them. But in fact, this means that none of us get to use them. Nobody gets to sit or rest. And this really impacts people with children, seniors, people with disabilities, and makes the urban space seem very hostile to other groups. And I think the symbolic gestures are also very low-hanging fruit. It can be contentious sometimes to remove a statue or to rename something, but it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it can happen if we sort of generate some energy around it, or you put a new monument or you put a new plaque that tells a different story about the history of a place. And those symbolic elements can make a difference in terms of how people feel welcome and included in the city. The sort of the bigger part of it about planning practice, I mean, I'm not a planner, so I don't want to tell people how to do their jobs, but I will just point out that
we will be listening.
Okay. There have been many decades of women trying to push for different sorts of planning practices, and part of that is this listening question. So when planners are designing something, for example, like you want to build an underpass for people to walk under a new highway or a new road. Well, you need to talk to a wide variety of people about how they're going to feel using that underpass. Is it going to be safe for everybody? Is it physically accessible? And often those questions are not considered. It's just, as you've said, kind of a technical exercise, like what is the most efficient and cheapest way to get people from point A to point B. But people don't live their lives like that. People make all sorts of decisions based on emotion, based on aesthetics, based on the feeling of a place, based on the other people who are in that space. So that listening to people tell you what they need, what they want, how they feel is, to me, kind of at the core of any urban planning practice. And from that, you can learn a lot about what actual physical changes to the environment you might make.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I think there is an idea coming as you're talking, but this is also very similar to one of the questions. It's from our great feminist friend and architect Helena Huber-Doudová, because if I would ask the question and let's adjust it to her, isn't it enough if just men listen to us and design it the same way? Why do we have to, be in there as women, I don't know, architects or geographers? Why do we have to be feminists? Isn't it enough just to tell it and then, men do it instead of us? And she's asking if this equitable city come with more equal gender representation. Do studies from Finland with high representation of women in government score better than in other cities? So is it connected, like the feminist city or more equitable city with more equitable political representation of women or in profession?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't have my statistics handy, but from what I've read, that in places where there is a greater political representation that includes women, then many of the issues that are seen as women's issues, like childcare, for example, get voiced in these political arenas, or they're not seen as so separate or secondary issues. They do come up more. And so it's not even that all of those women have to be feminists necessarily. It's just that probably their life experiences as a woman have cued them into different sorts of needs, different experiences that are less visible to the men. So I think political representation is a key aspect of this, and greater diversity, not just gender diversity, but all sorts of diversity in that sphere.
Thank you. Now we have like two spicy questions, or maybe one spicy question, like from Adam. Is it possible that the root of this problem for Western civilization is that the Bible was written by some uneducated misogyne? Like now it comes maybe the point that he's targeting is the religion, and also like church is obviously the oldest functioning structure, which was filled in with the men, and there is like very straight hierarchy. So I think it's a very good question, because this is the organization ruling the world, which is male dominated.
Yes, it's a good question. And I think for me, it reminds me of another point that I try to make in the book, which is that this gender equality problem in cities is not going to be solved just by more lighting or more toilets. It's not just a physical infrastructure problem. It is a social problem. And if we had figured out how to just design out sexism, hopefully we already would have. But that's not the only part of the picture. There are these broader forces, and religion is certainly one of them. All of the ideologies and belief systems that we have about what is normal for men and women, even just the notion that there is that singular, that sort of gender binary is very ingrained in us. So part of it is imagining how are we going to have a broader kind of social transformation that's not just about what planners and architects can do.
Yeah. And that's something that the book points out. It's not only about architecture, so architects cannot take some blueprint. It's also about, I think for me, it was like understanding the society and this values that are inherited. We inherit without raising any critical question. We just take them for granted. This is how we should behave. So more questions pop up. I really had to... So there is one from Hannah. She's asking, what examples of a feminist-friendly city would you give? Are there any? And how would you compare an average European city to an average North American city? So I wanted to ask about this American-European perspective. So here it goes.
Yes, thanks for that question. I wish I could say that there was a sort of perfect example of a feminist city out there. In my own experience as someone who's in my travels, which are not, all over the world, but I've always found Copenhagen to be a great example of a city where there's an attention paid to multiple modes of mobility. So it's not just all about the car. There's good public transportation. It's quite accessible. And there's also all of this cycling infrastructure. And even though I'm not really a cyclist myself, watching who is doing the cycling, and it's whole families, it's people taking their children to school and doing the groceries. And it's not just women doing that, but it's men as well. And to me, that suggests that there is a real valuing of kind of shared care labor, in a sense that the city can also facilitate that by the way that it designs how people get around to make it desirable and easy for multiple members of the family to engage in that work, and to not just shove it all onto women's shoulders. And in terms of North American versus European cities, I mean, North American cities kind of famously, the car is king, right? We have devoted so much space and so much attention to massive freeway systems, to getting people from the suburbs into the central city, that it can be very difficult to advocate for even just sidewalks, right? Pavements for people to walk on, or to even widen those, or to decrease car spaces. Hugely controversial, even though we need it for the environment and we need it for livability and all of these sorts of things. So that is and I think in European cities, there has been a better commitment to public transportation, to green city planning, and perhaps because there's also more like efforts at historic preservation of places, European cities have not been so willing to tear everything down to build a freeway, whereas we're quite willing to do that in North America. So that would be one of the key things that I would point to. And another interesting difference might be also around things like renting versus owning. In North America, the dream is to own your home and to own a big home, whereas in many European countries, renting and staying in the city and living in a relatively small living space is seen as fine. You know, you're not of a lower social status for doing that. Whereas in North America, if you live in a small apartment and you rent, it's like, no, that's a low status thing to do.
I'm right now very low.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Great. That we can carry on, but this question popped up, so I have to multiply my attention. Alžbeta Bruhová, this is a great young architect. She established a group in Prague called Architects or Lady Architects. So this is a supporting group for women architects who are discussing the problems that they face in a profession. So the question comes also professional, and she says, it always comes down to the question of who takes care of children. How come architecture at its core still has 24/7 supported culture, which means like architects work like non-stop, you know, and once you start to have any other life, meaning relationship or family, you are pushed out of the profession. So I want to ask you if you feel the same, for example, in academia or the professions that you work with. If this, always workaholic, efficiency pull in profession is not pushing out women, because we are not only parents, we want to also achieve something.
Yes, I think it's common in many professions that women experience, people say, a penalty for having children, that even taking some time out of the workforce to care for children, even if it's your guaranteed maternity leave, has an impact on your career over the long term. Whereas men, their careers get a boost when they have children, some of the research shows. So there's clearly an inequality there. And I do think that some of we could call it the culture of certain professions, which might be a 24/7 culture, or in academia, publish or perish, right? You have to be right to be productive, to be, again, working all the time, that this does reproduce gender inequalities, because depending on who has the responsibility for care labor, it's going to play out very differently. And this has really been heightened, I think, in the pandemic, when children were not at school for a long time in many places. And right now in Canada, in many places, children are learning online right now because of the high case numbers. So who's doing that work, right? It tends to be falling more on women's shoulders, yet they're still expected to do their full-time job. And I think we're going to see, as we move out of the pandemic, a real problem for women, that many women in the US, almost 1 million women have just left the workforce since the pandemic, just left, pushed out or had to leave because of this. So I think we're going to see this, a real ongoing issue for women post-pandemic, because so many will have had major career disruptions, or they will have been kind of held back because they haven't been able to be as productive as their male counterparts.
I'll keep the pandemic a little bit later. This is fascinating, and two of our questions are touching basically this topic, but maybe like personal question, because you describe how you manage in your profession. It's in the book, suddenly you were a single mother, and there was the rent to pay, and you were pushed out of this Toronto further and further, because this is what's happening if you have only one income and a child. And suddenly comes the professional career, and you describe like how you are, I don't know, happy if you find a neighbor and you create this micro kindergarten and you share the children and care work, and suddenly there is a totally different aspect. Like you have this formal facilities, designed for people, and then there is informal help from women that you have to just manage or die. So you describe how you survived this period, and it wasn't easy. You didn't find a way out, but now when you write about it, you feel, for example, change, or you call for change in your profession, like to be more generous or flexible with women.
Yes, absolutely. I think historically, women have always found these kinds of informal ways of surviving, whether it's looking after each other's children, sharing meals, grandparents and grandmothers looking after children, all of these ways to kind of juggle the things that they have to do, especially when might be single parents. So it's nothing new, really, but it's something that I think has not gotten much attention from the kind of maybe the planning, or even just the sort of the city building world hasn't really looked at the way that people create these informal survival networks. And I think we could learn a lot from them in terms of both what people need and the things that really work for them.
So let's stick with care. There are, as I mentioned, two questions that little bit reflecting on this. So there is a question from L, I don't know who that is, but how would a city designed around care look like? Can you show us some case of physical infrastructure? I guess very few planners can imagine what does it mean. And I'm adding it with the question from Marco, who is asking, is it possible to plan for the distant future? Can we plan city to reflect demographic changes and to be able to change with them? So I would say this is an excellent question when you say society is more like a puzzle, and not only aging, but there are different groups. So how would the care and facilities or city for the puzzle look like?
Yes, I agree. It's hard to imagine, and even I don't know exactly what the answer is, but some of the things that I've been thinking about have included, so we could think about transportation networks, so even public transit. So it's meant to take you from home to work in a linear journey. But what if you need to not go on that linear route, but you have to go over here to a school to drop off children, and then you have to go to your paid job, and then you have to go to the grocery store, and then you have to go to your mom's house to check on her, and then you go home. And our mobility systems are not really designed to make that very easy. You may have to go into the city and then out again, and then back in, and then back out again to go to two different neighborhoods, for example. You might have to pay multiple times to do that. The bus itself might not be accessible for your stroller or for your grocery cart. So it could be very hard to do that. So that's one thing we could think of. We could think of also the home. So can we imagine not just the single family home as the unit where care work happens, but are there other ways of living? Are there communal ways of living that, maybe not everybody wants that, but could it at least be an option where people could share cooking space, cleaning, like laundry facilities, but in a way that's not, that's designed to make it possible for people to share that work. So it's not just a laundry in the building, but something where people could take turns doing that work, for example, where there's shared play space for children. And we could also imagine, as I mentioned before, just a kind of a more human physical infrastructure. So if we want to think about socializing in urban space, which I do think is kind of part of care because we need human connection. Can we have places to sit where we could speak to one another? So not a bench over there and a bench over there where you can't see each other or talk, but like nice seating areas. Could we have more nature? Could we have more shelter and shade so people can use the urban environment? And I think all of those things kind of facilitate bringing care out of the home and into public space. And in terms of the kind of second part of the question, I do think about this a lot because, of course, we have a climate crisis. this is not going away just because we're thinking about a pandemic. So this is something we also have to think about in terms of long-term planning, right? How are we going to make a more sustainable city? And I do think that collectivizing things like care work is part of that, because it's not very efficient, energy efficient, labor efficient, time efficient to have everybody in their little box doing all of their own things. So we may be kind of forced to reckon with reshaping society in order to create environments that are much more, sustainable as our climate changes and we're faced with all of the challenges that are going to come to our food system, to our breathing, the quality of the air that we breathe and the water that we have. All of those things are going to be really critical. And I think we have to keep an equity lens on that and match it with a kind of green lens to be thinking long term in that way.
These are actually, these ideas about like care and the future. Recently I heard an excellent podcast, or it was a series of lectures on BBC. It was Mark Carney, like now he's governor of Bank of Canada, before Bank of England, and he was trying to align economic crisis, climate crisis, and pandemics. And basically, he said like markets or like economy should behave rationally because like certain rules or things like that. But he said like this pandemic showed us total irrational behavior. And now I'm going to speak very brutal, because he said like we start to take care of the elderly, and from like capitalist point of view, elderly is just like baggage. They don't produce economic flow. Basically we have to feed them, right? But now we start to take care of them because they are the most vulnerable group. And then he said like, and let's ask ourselves like, why is this? It's not only because everybody has a grandparent and we are altruistic, but it's also, this is our future. Pandemic showed us maybe like the winter of our days or like years. We're going to be isolated with limited options. We are aging. And then he accelerates this question, how can we create economy that encompasses care? And it seems like you are asking the same question, maybe providing answers, which means also like sharing facilities, creating different types of housing. And maybe I'm just provoking for another thought, but it's interesting that the economist grown on like this neolibertarian capitalism is asking the same questions.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think the pandemic has really shown us how poorly we treat elderly people in many Western societies, including here in Canada. This has been where most of the deaths from COVID have been people in long-term care homes, and primarily elderly people. And so when I suggest something like different modes of home and ways of living together, that could include intergenerational ways of living together, so that elderly people are not kind of shoved off, out of sight, out of mind, and left behind. Maybe it is about reintegrating all of our, generations in different ways, so that the care work is again valued, made visible, and that we do understand that our elders are not a drain on society, that they give us so much, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. We still have 6 questions. We should be talking, or like we were supposed to talk like 5 more minutes, but I think we should give this chance for the questions, because I would say this is unique event in Czechoslovakia in terms of topic. So there's a question from Anonymous. Okay, but speaking of critique from colleagues, and this is quite political, how do you view the current popularity of fellow Canadian Jordan Peterson? So this might be inside story for Canadians.
I don't know. I think we view him. It depends on your political point of view, but I do see him as kind of part of a very regressive set of social movements that have decided somehow that equality is a threat to men, a threat to the status quo, and maybe in a certain way it is, but the status quo isn't working very well, I think, for many people. So I don't think that his work has really any scientific or scholarly merit. So I don't give him too much attention. But unfortunately, I think he's part of a bigger puzzle of things that we're seeing in global political movements, of a kind of resurgence of misogyny, white supremacy, nationalism, and so on.
Mhm. Thank you very much. There are two more questions considering safety, because you mentioned this, and it's quite thought-provoking chapter as well. Not only about lightning, but also society. And so there are two questions that I'm going to join or merge. How urban planning can make cities safer for women? That's one provoking question. And Adam is asking again, safety for women is obviously in the mind of men. If we want it, it will happen. It is the same as the fight for equality. We need to want it, don't we? I mean, that's just a comment, but maybe tell us how you see the safety for women. It's like a little bit drives me crazy. Like somebody really has to take care for me, like I feel like a token.
Yeah, it is a difficult question. I mean, one of the things that there does need to be a concern for public safety, but of course, women experience the most violence in the home from intimate partners, from family members. So domestic violence is a much bigger problem statistically than women being attacked by strangers, which can happen. It's terrible. It's a problem. But day to day, the greatest threat that women have is in the home. So how do we make domestic violence an urban issue, right? How do we think about urban interventions into that? I don't know the easy answers to that, but they have to include women's economic inequality so that women are not as economically dependent on men. Again, the single family home hides a lot of violence within its four walls. So imagining different models of the home might be part of that picture as well. So I think men do have the power to stop violence against women, but it's clearly a deeply ingrained social problem that is not just about what happens in the public realm.
In the park. So the architecture or urban planning is not the entire answer. It's just making places more safe, clean or anything, but it's really the social context we have to change. A lot of social services for maybe helping these domestic violence victims. Okay, we have three more questions or comment. One is from Helena, and she mentioned the same. No way of feminists of the 60s, like in the West, the legal status of women in Czechoslovakia was already set. This is what I was saying. We had quite progressive past, then it came a little bit to reverse. Now we hope to continue this. There's a question from Samuel. I guess this is my colleague from Bratislava. It's asking this eloquent question. What were the major intellectual influences for your understanding of feminism and the city in the context of anthropogenic climate change? Sorry.
Sorry, is the question who are my academic influences? Was that
intellectual influences? Yeah.
I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, I won't throw specific names, but definitely part of what I research and teach has to do with the concept of environmental justice. And part of that is climate justice as well. So for me, thinking about anthropogenic climate change is also a question of who is most affected by environmental harms. And often it is poor communities, non-white communities who are at the front lines of experiencing the harm of everything from resource extraction to rising sea levels to agricultural issues. So it's a justice question. It's of course we will all be affected by climate change, but there are some people who are being more directly affected right now, especially in the global south. So for me, that is kind of where I come at that question, is to not just be concerned with stopping climate change, which, yes, I am concerned with, but also about asking those questions about like, what are the, who is being affected on the ground right now? And, what are we doing about that?
Mhm. Maybe just to set an example, I mean, like this environmental crises often go hand in hand. Who is affected? Like, heard a very good podcast in past few months, like when the hurricanes that hit, let's say, happen, and people are put into those camps, like together, like those shelters. It's really difficult time for members of LGBT community, because suddenly they are, in this group, and people tend to see them very differently. So very often there is like violent attacks against them when all people are crowded. So you can imagine this as particular case of who is more advantage or less advantage. And but again, it bringing me to question of vaccine. Like who is getting vaccine right now?
Yeah.
Or rich states, or people who are prominent enough. So this is another resource distribution that go hand in hand with you. Okay, so there is a question from Adelaide, and it's a very sweet question and a good question. What can I do for a more feminist city as an individual?
Yes, great question. I do think that people, sometimes it does seem like a big question, right? Like, what can I do? How can I intervene? I'm not the mayor. I don't have $1 million. What do I do? But I do think that we can try to create some of the kinds of relationships that we want. Again, maybe just with our neighbors, maybe with the people around us, maybe with the people that we work with, that are oriented towards, whether it's a question of collectivizing care work, how could we do that in our workplace, for example? What are different people's needs with respect to care? And could we find ways to meet those needs in different ways? It might be a question of being kind of an active bystander, when you see something happening, as long as you are also safe. But if somebody is being harassed on public transit, going and helping that person, not to confront a bully or something, but just going and standing next to a person who is being bothered on public transportation. It could be being writing letters to your city councilor or calling them and saying, we need more bus routes in this area because women can't get to work at this time, or whatever it might be. So I think there's little things that people can do. It's not about rebuilding your entire city, but it might be something quite local and something quite small that could be a nice spark.
Great. I think we have emptied all the questions from Slido, but I would still like to maybe continue a little bit. I would like to know, because this is another from series of this books about gender aspects, and I'm interested because one of your title is like Director of Women's and Gender Studies. Is this something that you applied for, or was it the byproduct of your specialization as an academic, that you kind of you created your own work, or like the job, and you started this? And why distinction between women and gender? Maybe because very often people don't understand the difference.
Yes, good question. I came into that role just as my university just has a small program in women's and gender studies. So we offer courses for students to take within that field. And so we just need somebody to oversee the program. And I was someone who had that academic background and was willing to do it, really. So it's not, I don't get paid extra to do it, put it that way. It's just part of the job. But the women and gender question is interesting because in North America in particular, when women's studies first started being a thing in the 1970s and 80s, it was just women's studies. But over time, many programs have incorporated the word gender because it's not just about women, right? Men have gender too, right? Gender does not just mean women's issues. Gender is, and men and women are perhaps not the only genders, right? There are multiple gender identities. So it's about thinking how gender as a category that we all relate to or have an identity within in some way shapes our lives. right? And it shapes it differently for men and women, but not always in ways that are good for men. Patriarchy, I don't think, is always good for men. It locks them into certain gender norms and ways of being that they don't, doesn't allow them to express their full selves. So it can also be about thinking about how men have been affected by patriarchy and sexist gender roles too. So gender just allows us to kind of open up that conversation and not just focus on women as one gender identity.
Maybe I will just a little bit expand this question. Often we hear this like article, or we read these articles that in Indian tribes or like Native American tribes, there used to be tribes that I don't know, like recognize 5 types of genders already, and then we have this modern version of LGBTQ. You know, like it seems like the history reinvent itself. Is this something that, and especially these tribes are like North America? Do you have these tribes also in Canada, like still present, or how does it translate into politics of Canada? Or maybe, and if you, for example, do research focus on this field, and if not you, then if maybe your colleagues.
Well, yes, absolutely. Canada has hundreds of different Indigenous groups that have survived all sorts of attempts to basically eliminate and control them. And in fact, I would say that it seems like there's a real resurgence of Indigenous culture and political identity and activism and so on across the country. As an urban geographer, I'm not an expert in this, but I do try to pay attention to the fact that, you know, Canada and the US, for example, are what we call settler colonial states, right? Places where the colonizers never really left and where Indigenous people are still secondary in many ways. So cities were places where colonizers kind of stamped their power and further dispossessed Indigenous people. So I try to be aware of that history and that that Indigenous issues can also be urban issues. But I think with respect to your point about, you know, gender and sexuality, that many Indigenous people are for themselves rediscovering that because they were kind of forced into very colonial European norms, or in our case, very British and French norms of gender roles. And we're told that the way that they organized their households, their political structures, their sexualities were no good, right? And they were forced into very narrow Catholic or Protestant gender norms as well. So many of them are rediscovering their own ancestral traditions. And we have a lot to learn from that, I think, as you're suggesting.
I chose this question specifically because maybe my last question for this streaming would be, again, pandemics, but also your last chapter is also like city of protest. And I like that you included that because, okay, you yourself were active in different like protests, and also Czech Republic and Slovakia experienced huge protests, particularly last 2 years after certain murders or government changes, big things. And suddenly it was normal to be out there. And you raise this question like, okay, many movements were, let's say, supported by women significantly, doing all this production work, organizational work, and in the end, there is always a man at the forefront of this movement. And you read the history, and suddenly the women fell out, and especially the new government, this form, women fell out, and it's like it makes me really angry because I can see it now, like around me. That's one thing that the book is discussing. But now the pandemics, maybe another aspect of this is our, let's say, public life has been suppressed, and we cannot suddenly participate politically. And there are many politicians, especially with this authoritarian, like taste or like flashes, they try to reach out for unprecedented moves, especially in Europe. There's Belarus or Hungary, Viktor Orban, or in Slovenia. Like they're trying to change many fundamental rights when people cannot really protest. They cannot go out. They cannot really do things. And while we are experiencing this for 1 year, I would like to share something personal. Like I'm quite active person in public life, but I feel so exhausted that and this politics have gone so wild that I feel like I'm reaching certain point of internal immigration. I just don't participate at politics at all, and I'm all this privileged woman with education. I currently don't have family, so I have all energy and means to participate on protest. So my question points out, like, can you see this exhaustion, and what do you think will happen with public life and female participation after this is over, if it's over? Will we need some, resuscitation or,
Yes, we might. I think you're right. I think many people are exhausted, and maybe women, especially if they have either young children or maybe they have elderly parents that they're also caring for and worried about, and the crunch of trying to provide for your family at a time when many people, especially women, are losing their jobs and are facing precarious housing, all these sorts of things. And you're right, that does perhaps put a damper on people's ability to engage in public life because you're just dealing with like a constant emergency at home. And one thing that I've said in other talks is thinking like when this is over, whatever that kind of means, will it be a situation where women say, never again, never again will we be put in that situation of having to choose between our job and our children and our, health. We don't want to be in that situation anymore. So if I'm feeling optimistic, I think we could see a new movement for better paid sick leave, maternity leave, universal childcare, all of those things. Maybe we will see that resurgence. But we may also, as you said, be fighting against the fact that many conservative and right-wing governments will have tried to use this time to further their own agendas. So I think maybe it will be a little bit of both.
Yeah. So that will be my last question for Leslie on this topic. I will ask technical support from Kern because I don't see them right now to show up, so then we can live in peace and not having this Facebook stream to broadcast our households. Here's Danielle. So thank you, Leslie. Thank you very much. I would like to mention again, please read Feminist City. It is a very interesting read for me. It's like it's like Alice in the Wonderland. It doesn't give you any solution for if you are architect or planner, but it will give you understanding of the person who is not equipped with all these privileges to have successful life in currently designed cities. So it will give you food for thought, and it will give you certain topics like mobility or housing or caregiving aspects or even democratic issues that you can dive in and see the world of inequalities through your own eyes. So this is the best asset of the book. So please read it. Or if there is any Czech publisher between our audience or some friend of them, I strongly urge to do a translation. So thank you very much. Please pay attention to Urban Talks. I don't know what's the next talk, but it's going to be fairly soon. So thank you very much and have a good evening from Bratislava and from Sackville, right?
Thank you so much. It was very great to be here.
Thank you.